Hi, everyone. I'm Cheryl Benteen from the Manhattan Transfer, and you are listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
That was very Julie London.
Ooh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Nowhere in the world celebrates modernism better than Palm Springs, California during Modernism Week. It's every February, 11 days of an architecture and design festival. And U.S. Modernist Radio is there, interviewing keynote speakers plus special guests at the U.S. Modernist Compound inside the amazing retro Hotel Skylark. If you're into mid-century modern, Modernism Week is a joyous festival of insightful lectures, plentiful martinis, and much more. We've got a full roster of guests from Palm Springs, including Jacques Caussin on Raymond Loewy, Lila Cohen on Herb Greene, Alan Hess on Googie architecture, and Michelangelo Sabatino and Maristella Casciato on Carlo Mollino. That's a lot of people, and when you join us for Modernism Week, you have a lot of options for things to see. Some of our trips are all planned in advance, but if you just want to strike out on your own, it helps to have your own U.S. Modernist Uber account. That's right, everybody who joins us gets a preloaded account with Uber. That way, no matter what you want to see in Palm Springs, or no matter how late you stay out tying one on at the restaurants and the clubs, you know you can always safely get back to the U.S. Modernist Compound at the Hotel Skylark. Just pull out your phone, if you can find it, and your semi-private chauffeur will bring you back into the fold. And at every party, the guy who always had on the best shoes, so much that people stopped him to take photos, here's Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. You know, those shoes do get a lot of questions, and I want to tell you the story of how this came about. So a number of years ago, when we first started going out to Palm Springs and these great parties, I had ordered a cordless drill just to use around the house. Just a typical kind of cordless drill from Amazon. It came, it was great. And about a month later, I got an email from Amazon that said, George, if you like this cordless drill, you might like these shoes. And what they showed me were these really wild gold and black shoes that looked like something you'd see on a Vegas lounge singer. And I thought to myself, Amazon, you really know me. And instantly ordered the shoes, which really weren't that expensive. And then, of course, once I'd gone down that road, Amazon would write back with more shoe suggestions.
Really? Just shoes?
Just shoes.
Wow.
So now I have about 4 pairs of wildly exotic shoes that I wear to parties out there and occasionally to ones around North Carolina.
And they pair perfectly with your tools.
Exactly.
Sure.
You want your hardware and your software to work together. If this sounds like a blast, and trust me, it really is, come stay with U.S. Modernist in Palm Springs in 2024. Just drop your bags at the hotel and we'll fill your days with tours and talks and parties and dinners. Just email me for information at george@usmodernist.org. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Modernism Week is a great time to learn about architects and designers whose innovations continue to inspire decades later. First up, Jacques Caussin. He's been dealing in mid-century design his whole career. Originally from France, Jacques eventually came west, and in 2001 he decided to mount a modernism show in Palm Springs that has evolved into Modernism Week. This year, he spoke on Raymond Loewy, the French-born industrial designer and Palm Springs resident, who's famous for his design of the Studebaker Avanti, among many other well-known product designs. Here's George's poolside conversation with Jacques on a rare, sunny morning last February.
Jacques, I understand that there is a really wonderful French bakery here in town now that you were quite the fan of.
Yes, indeed. And they came to Palm Springs several years ago, fell in love with the town and the architecture, and decided to make a whole new life in Palm Springs. So they opened that bakery, and the owner was a baker in France of pastry. So they got somebody to make the bread besides him doing the pastries. So they offer the whole range of, from the regular baguette to wonderful cakes and pastries and etc. So it's wonderful.
What's the name of it?
It's called Peninsula.
And where is it in town?
It is on the south side of Palm Canyon, near, actually the more famous place around there is a thrift shop called Revivals.
Oh, yes. I was there recently. That's a great little thrift shop.
Indeed. And so they're right there at the corner. It's a very, very hard life because, Christophe gets up at 10 in the evening to go to work, and his wife, joins him around 3 a.m. and she manages the store until 5 p.m. So it's really remarkable the amount of work that they put in.
But there are always lines over there to
There's
get in.
always lines to get in, and you should be there around Christmas time. It's unbelievable. There's 10 people waiting outside, waiting to get in. It's just amazing. And so happy for them.
Now, you have been associated with Modernism Week a long time. I've heard you referred to as one of the founding fathers of Modernism Week. Does that make you the mod father?
The mod father, yeah, right, indeed. That's very good. I never heard that one. Yes, I was one of the founders back there in 2006.
And now this is what, the 20th year almost?
Well,
17th year.
17th year, or maybe 18, 18, I think, 18th time.
Okay.
And now, when we started, we just did February, and then after a couple of years, we said, well, this is so successful, we should do one in October. One of the reasons also was that the whole tourism industry here, the hotels and everything said, well, we like that you're here, but in February, we don't have problems selling out anyway. So if you were to do something in October, that would be really good, and we would help you with rooms, etc., etc.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly grown to be a magnificent festival. Oh, my God, it's huge now.
Quite amazing. It's just mind-blowing. And on my way here to meet with you, I saw 3 walking groups, local, exploring the neighborhoods. And then, they were right in front of Cary Grant's house. And then there was a double-decker bus tour that was driving by. It's just amazing how successful it is. I mean, it's wonderful.
During Modernism Week, you are speaking on Raymond Loewy, who is a well-known name here, but not necessarily far afield. So tell me about Raymond Loewy.
Well, Raymond Loewy was actually, in the 1930s, after World War I, the 20s, when the world really changed a lot, there were a lot of European-born industrial designers who moved here to the country. And Raymond Loewy was the only French-born one. And I got interested in him when, in the late 80s, when I had my gallery in Soho in New York, and I started specializing in 1930s industrial design, and his name came up, and then I started researching more about him and finding all that he did. And then I made a presentation this past Modernism Week.
Yes. And Loewy was quite talented. I mean, he did work for the space program. He designed automobiles. What are some of the different things he designed?
It's just incredible. It's just incredible. When you know his achievement, you realize that from the very moment each of us is born, we are exposed to his designs several times a day. Whether we go to the post office, because he redesigned the U.S. Postal Service logo. Then when you go to get gas at the Shell station, well, he designed that logo. his range of achievement is just incredible because he started in the 20s redesigning a refrigerator at the very early days of such an item, and then ended up his career designing the interior of a space station for NASA. It's just the range, the relevance is just amazing. I mean, he was born in the 19th century. He designed the 20th century, and his legacy is really totally du jour in the 21st century.
He was also very involved in the automotive industry.
Oh, yes, from the very early days. And the first one he designed commercially was the Hupmobile in 1932. And, of course, the most important relationship was with Studebaker later on. And he designed the famous Avanti right here, actually, in Palm Springs. When he had a house here in Palm Springs designed by Albert Frey.
Famous architect here, yes.
Famous local architect here, and his house is right next door to the notorious Kaufman, the so-called Kaufman House, which was designed by Richard Neutra. Both of the houses were built in 1946.
That whole neighborhood is full of very interesting houses over there.
Oh, indeed, and many. There's nothing more iconic than the Kaufman House. I mean, it's worldwide, but there's many houses in that neighborhood. It's just remarkable that the quality and the talents of the architects who worked locally is just mind-blowing.
So for our listeners who are a little younger, tell them what a Studebaker was.
I think the first Studebaker that he designed was in 1938, because I've seen pictures of the Studebaker 1939 model that was taken pictures right at the New York World's Fair. And his pictures with the Trilon and Perisphere behind, etc. So that gave him a lot of notoriety, undoubtedly, and he designed for them regularly. What also happened during World War II is that the regular sort of quote-unquote manufacturers could not do cars because of the war, and they were obliged to work for the government and do military-related things. But Loewy was an independent purveyor for Studebaker, so the rules that applied to the big auto manufacturers did not apply to them, to Studebaker. So he was able to keep designing for them, and the end result is that after the war, the first new model that came on the market was a Studebaker 2 years ahead of the so-called Big Three.
Right. And what was so distinctive about the Studebakers?
The look, the modern look, the design of it was really what was special.
It had sort of an Art Deco kind of look, as I recall?
Yeah, a bit more streamlined. I mean, in the 20s, there had been the concept of speed had really taken major importance, and whether it was cars or airplanes, all that became very part of our civilization.
As you were researching Raymond Loewy, what were some of the things that you really loved or surprised you?
Well, he did such a range of things that it was just amazing. He even designed, in the 60s, he designed a line of furniture. He had an office in Paris and, of course, an office here in New York. And what was amazing is that all the manufacturers, he did not design everything. At the peak, he had 140 people working for him, architects, designers, etc., etc.
That's a lot for an industrial design firm.
That's a lot. They worked all over the world, literally. And the clients, even though Loewy did not design an item, this particular item, let's say, the fact that it came from his company and the recipient, the client always claimed it was Loewy design because they used the name, as...
It had a cachet.
It had a cachet, and they're not going to say, it was designed by so-and-so from the Loewy office. No, that wouldn't make sense for them to say that. They just always gave full credit to Raymond Loewy.
I know during the 60s there was really a boom in design of products, things that were very functional. in the 50s started getting stylized.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, even earlier, because that's one of the things that Loewy just made him sort of angry in a way, is that the modernization of the world came without recognition of the importance of the design, of the appearance of an object. And of course, when things grew and more products were on the market, the only difference between product A and product B was the appearance and the design, which is, we now, when we hear that, we say, duh. But in fact, at that time, it was a whole new concept to give an object a special appearance to make it more appealing.
And like with anything, there was controversy about it because the people who liked just something for its functionality would argue, why pay more for this well-designed thing, right?
Right. Well, his talent was that eventually people didn't have to pay more.
Yeah, eventually, right.
Of course. And also the big thing that happened is when the Depression hit, the companies had to survive, and then they realized that what allowed them to survive was the fact that the appearance of what they were selling was better than the appearance of their competition.
Yeah.
And then people bought that, so they went, well, maybe, we have to be really concerned about what our products look like.
Right. I've seen it said several times that if the Apple iPhone looked like the Androids when it came out, it wouldn't have done nearly as well.
Exactly. Yeah. No, for sure, of course. And in the 60s, his company really designed a lot of things. I mean, they designed, as I mentioned, a line of furniture. They designed a line of cookware for a French company. They designed sewing machine. And just the range of items they designed is just amazing.
When I was growing up, my dad, who was an architect, had me running copies of specifications on a Gestetner mimeograph.
Oh, yes.
And I understand he was involved with the Gestetner early on.
That was when he switched, yes, and that was in the early 20s. Mr. Gestetner approached him. What had happened is that Loewy, after World War I, moved to New York right after the war because he had unfortunately lost both his parents during the influenza epidemic of 1918, and his two brothers who already lived in New York. So he joined his brothers and started his career in New York as a fashion illustrator, of all things. He designed ads for Bonwit Teller and everything, and that's what gave him a lot of notoriety. And then when Mr. Gestetner asked him to redesign their mimeograph machine, then it took off, and his whole career as an industrial designer really just exploded.
And most people today don't even know what a mimeograph machine looks like because we're used to what we would call a copier or Xerox, which is a photographic process. Yeah. But a mimeograph machine was this big metal hulk.
Right.
That you had a ink tube that you would hook into it. And then, at least the one I had, and then you put a stencil over the top, and then you would run it around, and you would squish the ink through the stencil, and it would print on the pages.
Yes. It was a big machine.
Yeah.
It was a big equipment. And what Loewy redesigned, the initial apparatus was totally very, very cumbersome and totally unpleasing to the eye.
He made it very sleek.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
In fact, if you see them on eBay or something else like that, it doesn't look necessarily that old. It still looks very futuristic.
It does, certainly does. Yeah, that was just amazing. And because he had, before being a fashion illustrator in the early 20s when he moved to New York, at a young age he had designed an airplane model. So he had that technical ability and also the aesthetic ability, and that between the two of them, that really is a perfect profile for an industrial designer.
Well, Jacques, thank you for coming and spending some time talking about Raymond Loewy.
My very pleasure. He was French, so...
Yeah.
So,
say no more.
As I always say, he was French, he was handsome, and he was full of himself. So what's not to like about him? Thank you.
That was Jacques Caussin chatting with George.
Bay Area architect Lila Cohen specializes in neighborhood-based supportive housing. She also designs tiny homes and has one, and has been on the show Tiny House Hunting. She is the co-author of the book Herb Greene's Generation, 6 decades of collage, art, and architecture generated with perspectives from science. And she's the producer of the upcoming documentary Remembering the Future with architect Herb Greene, a film devoted to Greene and the rise and fall of the organic architecture movement. Here's our conversation with Lila in Palm Springs. Lila, usually I ask the guest a fun question about their past that's unconnected to architecture at all. But I wanted to just say that in watching the trailer for your film, what you've really put together, besides a history of organic architecture, is this huge love letter to Herb Greene, who is your, great uncle?
Yeah. Herb Greene is my great uncle. So, he's 93. I'm, 50 or more years younger than him. And he's the closest person to me in my life, really, at this point. So, honoring him has become so important to me. And that's the film really, in a way, is a lot about that, is honoring his legacy.
I really like that you made the decision to feature yourself in the film, because that's when that love comes through. If you weren't in the film, if you were just the producer or the director and you were just talking to talking heads after talking heads, you wouldn't see that as much. It's quite touching.
Well, thank you. It was an accident that I ended up sort of in front of the camera. I wasn't planning on it because I've very purposely wanted to stay out of the way and just really focus on Herb Greene, on his work, on that history. We were going to film in Oklahoma, and we had everything all ready to go, and he was going to be walking through his buildings and sort of kind of going back into time, but with a female architect who's the director at the school there. And this was during COVID times, and she tested positive for COVID the day before. So we had to sort of scramble on, who's a woman architect who could step in, knows the project, and knows Herb Greene really well. So it was kind of an accident.
That would be you.
That would be me. And, it did work out really beautifully, and it kind of opened up these other doors on what is the story really about, is where we are now, which is my personal desire to understand the work and understand the history and honor my uncle.
Most people who follow modernism know the work of Gropius and Breuer and Mies van der Rohe and the international style of modernism. But starting in around the late 30s, early 40s, a new style of architecture emerged called, eventually, organic architecture. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think it's pretty common for modernism to be related to Bauhaus movement, international style, so those figures you mentioned. And it was at that time, and it is still now, the case where then organic modernism, organic architecture that started to erupt out of Oklahoma was kind of the antithesis of that modernist movement that was very rigid and repetitive and trying to sort of find purity in design, but by doing that, trying to do a one-size-fits-all. And organic architecture, the values behind it ended up becoming called organic architecture, but it really didn't start as we're organic architects. It's just that their values were based on continually reinventing what the response to a particular site, a particular client was going to be. It was never one size fits all, because every single one of us is different, and every single site is different, and every moment is different. And so they had this really rich way of looking at the world, very open and inclusive. And that in the 30s, 40s, and then 50s, and then it slowly started to die down. But it was really radical and beautiful. Just wasn't very appreciated at the time, because I think at that period, there was this interest in scalability. There was this interest in predictability. And I think at this point in time, I feel that there's more of an openness and a desire to understand these other values, that the world is sort of bigger than that.
What was going on at the University of Oklahoma in the 40s that had this be a center
for organic architecture?
Well, at the University of Oklahoma, really the catalyst to the organic architecture that sprouted from there was Bruce Goff. He was the chairman of the school. He was born and raised in Oklahoma. And in essence, he was a genius. He was a prodigy who was designing from the time he was 13 and really just had an affinity for art. For architecture, of course, that's where his medium, but he also painted. He also was an enthusiast of Japanese art, of music, jazz in particular, classical music, Debussy. And he really encouraged all of his students to kind of look beyond what was right in front of them or what was expected of them. He would always say, don't follow fashion. Forget about what everybody else is doing. And that was highly unique. All the other schools, Harvard, IIT, they were saying, you have to do Mies van der Rohe style houses. You have to follow the Bauhaus. And if you don't know what you're talking about, you don't know what you're doing. So that made Bruce Goff very unique, where he was saying, be free, and respond to what's there.
And this would be in a style that just could go anywhere.
That's right. It can go anywhere because it's intended to reflect wherever you are. And so, the work that they did always looked very different. There's no Bruce Goff building that looks the same. There's no Herb Greene building. Herb Greene didn't do nearly as much work as Goff. Goff was, he did 150 buildings, extremely prolific. And Uncle Herb did, in comparison, really almost like just a handful, about a dozen. And they're all different because of the site and the clients and program, et cetera.
Do you think that working in Oklahoma, the environment was part of what triggered his different approach to architecture? The plains, the Midwest?
Yeah, I think the circumstances in Oklahoma made it more possible for someone like Bruce Goff to, really express that type of teaching style and have it be accepted. And then for the students to kind of take inspiration from, the openness of the landscape there. But, I think, whereas it was just more rigid in these other schools, but I'd like to believe that if Bruce Goff or those kinds of values were implemented in other places, you
like
would
at
get
Harvard,
right?
That you'd still get the same openness.
Well, you'd get something original.
Right.
You'd get something that was unique and exploring and trying to understand the world better, not just build a box every time.
One of the things, too, that helped Bruce Goff was that the dean of architecture before him was an avowed modernist and was promoting that, accepted style of internationalism. And then he left to come to Raleigh, North Carolina and teach at NC State. And that opened up the window for Goff's influence to take over at Oklahoma.
I see. I actually didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's quite something. Yeah. Well, kind of lightning struck when Goff came to become chairman of the school. He was a homosexual man, which was really at that time not really acceptable. In fact, you had to hide that. But yet he was fairly open about that. And, that university embraced him, which I think that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. For that time, particularly.
For that time. Even today, you think, well, Oklahoma is really conservative.
Yeah.
And yet there was this community that was not. They were actually ahead of everybody.
Well, let's shift to Herb. So Herb studied under Bruce Goff and then went on to start his own practice. And one of the houses that you feature in the documentary trailer that we watched was the Prairie House. What's that house all about?
Yeah, Uncle Herb did the Prairie House when he was in his 20s. So he was really young. I think back of when I was in my 20s to have the command that he had to do something like the Prairie House was pretty astonishing. So the Prairie House is out, at that time anyway, out in the middle of kind of nowhere, out on the plains. And he wanted to do a house that reflected the prairie, that was all about the prairie. So he comes up with this design that just kind of knocks your socks off because it's so unusual. And he built it with, I think, one carpenter and his son that he says was not very good, but he just built a little model. And, if you've ever seen any drawings of the Prairie House, it's like almost like a football shaped floor plan. It's actually, this is the floor plan, these earrings. And, it's shaped that way because the skinny pointy side points to the east, which is where the winds come from Oklahoma. So it was really trying to respond to it being in tornado land. And then the wind would sort of get softened around the curve.
It's almost like a ship.
It is almost like a ship.
Seen from above.
Yeah. So, even though it's an unusual geometry, it's somewhat of a simple geometry in plan. But then as he takes it up in elevation, which this is kind of the situation with many Goff buildings and Greene buildings, is you look at the plan and you think this is pretty understandable plan. It's very reasonable. But then when they go up, all this kind of magical stuff happens and these forms really take shape. And so Uncle Herb did a very simple materials. It's just wood shingling, wood boards, wood shingling, black mineral paper on the outside. But he created this, sort of skin to the building that makes the building look like it has fur or feathers. And it's really trying to look like the grasses. It has these reveals that are like the ravines of the prairie. And that big eye kind of looking out onto the prairie sort of looks like a head kind of leaning down in a gesture of a poignancy. And it also has a somewhat aggressive look too. And that's all intentional, that it looked like many different things. And then that building was photographed by Julius Schulman, which is kind of also an accident. Schulman was there to photograph the Babinger House, which was only a mile away.
Bruce Goff.
By Bruce Goff, yeah. So Schulman's there to photograph Bruce Goff buildings, and Babinger House is only a mile away from the Prairie House. And I think someone said, you should go take a look at Herb Greene's house. So Schulman goes over there and, is really stunned at what he's seeing. And, Uncle Herb is so not, he's sort of out of it when it comes to like publicity or anything. So he wasn't even going to let him photograph it. But Uncle Herb's wife, Mary, said, you should let him photograph it. So he photographed it, took it to the editors of Life magazine, and, they published it, I think, the next week, in the next issue. Because it was just so stunning.
In the documentary, you and Herb walk through the Prairie House at some point, and it's not in very good shape. How did it manage to survive at all these years?
Yeah, I mean, after, it's over 60 years now that house has been standing there. And it is made out of wood. So the exterior looks very worn down. It's in very bad shape on the outside and mostly on the south side, which makes sense because that's really where the sun kind of beats down. It had one owner most of its life. Uncle Herb, it was for his family originally. He lived there but not long, a little over a year. Mm-hmm. And then he moved to Kentucky. He got a teaching job there. And a woman named Janie, I think it's Janie Wilson, she lived in it for, I think, 45, 50 years until she passed away. And she loved this house. She was a very eccentric lady, and she just loved this house. I don't think she took the best care of it because it needs a certain amount of maintenance. And, it was Uncle Herb's first house on his own. And like all of us in any work that we do, our first work, we learn things. So he would have detailed some things differently so that maybe it wouldn't have leaked as much.
Right.
There's just, you're still learning sort of the technical aspects of building. So it's kind of remarkable it is still standing. The interior is surprisingly in great shape. There is some staining of water, but in general, for how long it's been there, it's that wouldn't take much work to fix. But it's the exterior. It's like taking a sculpture and you'd have to take its skin off and then put all of its texture back on in the same way. But there's a nonprofit called the Prairie House Preservation Society. They've taken it over. They have a board. I'm on that board. And our goal is to restore this house to its former glory.
Why do you think organic architecture didn't catch on in the country?
Well, I have a few thoughts as to why organic architecture didn't catch on. And one of them is the schools were just refusing to teach anything other than international style. So they're just churning out students who are only going to do that kind of style. So I think that's part of it. I think the other part is there was media coverage of organic architecture. And at the beginning, a lot of it was positive and very, sort of respectful, just like you would be of any good architecture. Mm-hmm. But there was enough negative misperceptions of what the architecture was. Bruce Goff's architecture was being called kitsch, or it was being called wacky, that maybe they were on drugs, really diminishing the quality of their work, or, didn't seem to be much interest in really understanding it, but just sort of looking at it and this is weird, so discount it. So I think the media interpretation was not helpful. And I think the other reason is economy. There's an economy of scale. Organic architecture can't really be scaled because it's unique every time. And that makes a difference. So modernist, as we think of modernist international style architecture, it's intended to be scaled. It's intended to be mass produced. Mm-hmm. So I think that had a lot to do with it.
There's no sort of economic engine behind organic architecture like there is for other kinds of structures.
Or prefab structures where you can just stamp them out.
Right.
You can't stamp out an organic house.
No, I mean, I would certainly...
You can try, but...
I'd be interested to... I would been if like Goff and Greene had been given the program of design something in some way in which you could do an organic house. I wonder if they would have a kit of parts where you could still create variety, so that you can respond to the site and place. But it's difficult. It's reinventing every time, which is scary to people. So yes. I think, there's just a fear and fear and misconception. I think those really kind of killed the organic architecture movement.
Yeah. The film is Remembering the Future with Herb Greene. What is the website people can go to learn more about Herb and the film?
People can go to rememberingthefuturewithherbgreene.com.
Oh, very easy.
Yeah.
Okay. Greene.
Yes.
Thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
We were speaking with documentary filmmaker Lila Cohen. Architect Alan Hess is the author of 21 books on architecture. Born in California, Alan studied architecture at UCLA and had his own architectural practice focusing on residential design and preservation. The former architecture critic for the San Jose Mercury News, he has written extensively on Frank Lloyd Wright, Oscar Niemeyer, ranch houses, and John Lautner. He's appeared on countless architecture documentaries, and he is the most frequent guest here on U.S. Modernist Radio. He's also given the most talks and moderated the most panels at Modernism Week. Alan is a contributor to the book Googie Modern, Architectural Drawings of Armit Davis Newlove, for which he took a deep dive into the private archives of Louis Armit, Eldon Davis, and Victor Newlove, known as the fathers of Googie. What is Googie? You'll find out. Here's George with Alan Hess.
Alan, welcome back.
Thank you. Always good to be here.
You're still our number one most frequent guest. I think I counted 9 times, maybe so far.
Well, and it's been on different subjects, so it hasn't been boring for me, maybe the audience, but not me.
Oh, no, everybody loves a little Alan.
Good.
And today we're going to talk about Googie, which is not Google, that came along later, but Googie as a style of architecture. And it was also a restaurant, right? Tell us about that.
Yeah. The term Googie refers to an architectural style.
Yeah.
But it was given that name after one specific restaurant, which was named Googie's on the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles. And it was designed by John Lautner, the great architect in Southern California, the Chemisphere House, the Sheets Goldstein House. And he also did actually some drive-in restaurants and this fairly small restaurant called Googie's. And it became a real hangout for the hip young actors in Hollywood in the late 40s, early 1950s. People like James Dean hung out there.
Who could be cooler than that, really?
No one cooler than James Dean. But Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe and all of these other method actors of that time would go there. That gave it a certain cachet. That isn't why the style is named after it, though. Oh, and I do have to mention, it is pronounced Googies.
Googies.
Not Googies.
Okay.
And I get that question all the time, but it's Googies.
Googies, okay.
Yeah.
Now, what characterizes this particular style of design?
Okay, the original Googies was in 1949. Actually, there were other earlier examples of the style, but it was so new that it had not been identified or given a name. But this is after the war. The suburbs are growing. People are driving around, living their lives in their cars more and more. The commercial strips are growing, becoming the dominant urban design idea of that time. And architects had to respond to that. They had to design buildings which are not going to be noticed by pedestrians walking along a sedate sidewalk on Fifth Avenue or Main Street, USA.
Right.
These customers would be driving by in their car in 30, 40 miles an hour. So architecture had to respond to be noticed, to communicate itself, and also to provide a service for these people who were, living their lives, going to their work, going to schools, going shopping, going to the dry cleaners, going to the bank, whatever, in their cars. So the solution to that problem, as John Lautner and a number of other architects determined, was to increase the scale of the building and to put a roof on it that would be noticeable. And the symbolism, the meaning of the building had to be, we're with it, we're of the times. This is part of modern life. We fought the war, we fought the Depression, and we want to live a better life. And that meant modern architecture.
Right.
In houses, in commercial buildings, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what then these buildings and these architects responded to. They also had large amounts of glass, big sheet panels of glass.
So you could see from the outside in what was going on in there.
Exactly, and vice versa as well. Very important, visibility, transparency. And the materials had to be modern as well. And of course, it wasn't going to look historic in any way. It was going to have modern lines, shapes, forms, etc.
These shapes and forms were really wild for the time. I mean, you had triangles and circles and things stacked on top of each other and big signs and angular roofs. I mean, what were some of the elements that were very popular like that?
Yeah, well, they were derived from modern engineering concepts like cantilevers. So, yeah, you would have a roof that would swoop out without any columns to it, anchored by some sort of base, but really hovering over the site. Or the folded plate roof. These are the zigzag roofs that you'll often still see, certainly around here in Palm Springs. Mm-hmm. Well, the reason is that a folded plate is stronger than just a plain flat roof.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about a sheet of paper, just a flat sheet of paper, it's kind of wobbly and everything. But if you fold it into accordion forms,
right,
it will hold up itself more easily as well. And if you do it in concrete, it's even stronger.
Yeah.
So all of these, what were called wild forms, had their root in some modern engineering architectural principle.
Okay. And these places of this style of architecture, they were also designed to be fun. You were supposed to go really have a good time at a place that had this Googie architecture.
Well, one of the great contributions of Southern California modern architecture in this mid-century period was fun.
Yeah.
Pleasure, enjoyment. And you see it in houses and you see it in commercial buildings. Architecture, modern architecture, serious modern architecture had been very straight-laced. It was serious. You had to have a PhD to really kind of appreciate it for what it was. But in Southern California, people and architects threw that out and said, No, we have all these tools of modern design. Let's improve life, make it better, more fun.
Mm-hmm. So if you saw a place like Norm's, you'd want to go in and have some eggs in the morning, and there's all this activity around. It's very bustling. Really a neat place to go have a meal.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned Norm's. That's a chain started in the late 40s here in Southern California, and it's still in business. But they were some of the earliest adopters of the Googie style after this original Googie's restaurant was built and then the term came into common use. Mm-hmm. So, we're glad that they're still around.
Besides John Lautner, who were some other architects that were working in Googie?
Well, one of the primary purveyors were Arme and Davis.
Okay.
And that's Eldon Davis and Louis Arme, who were classmates at USC Architecture School before World War II. And USC Architecture School was one of the primary architecture schools in the country that taught modern architecture. Most architecture schools were still teaching traditional styles and Beaux-Arts and so forth. Mm-hmm. So that's where they came from. And USC was known for that. And then for various reasons, they got into restaurants and these Googie coffee shops.
Now, at some point, public opinion turned against Googie. When was that?
Well, Googie is a popular style. It's popular architecture. And you look at the history of popular architecture and, it can be kind of a flash in the pan. Googie really was popular and used for, close to 30 years, which really is an extraordinary extent of time.
It's a good run, yeah.
Very good run, but around 1970, again, architecture is an expression of culture. What were people interested in that? The first Earth Day came along. We began to be aware of ecological issues, pollution of air and water and so forth. And so public taste changed away from the optimism of the post-war modern architecture and Googie because he said, the atomic bomb did not really provide cheap energy for everyone safely. There were problems there. Yeah. And so the public was ready for a more broad awareness of the ecology and so forth. That resulted in a change in styles to more traditional forms. That's when McDonald's, for example, introduced their mansard roof, kind of angled, shingled roof line around it. Used brick, for example, again, traditional materials, not the stainless steel and neon of Googie.
Right. How many of the Googie buildings got wiped out in those next couple decades?
It was a massacre. They were not maintained well. They deteriorated. They looked awful. The neon broke. They were replaced by newer prototypes. That was company policy for so many of the big fast food chains and so forth. So I don't have a number exactly, but
it was a lot of them.
It was a lot. To the point where by the 1980s, Googie buildings were so rare that people began to love them again.
Yeah.
And say, hey, these were great and we're losing them and let's start to save some.
I wanted to ask you, because I was thinking of this on the way over here, is the Arby's big hat sign an example of Googie or not? Those old, huge, 30-foot tall signs they would have out in front of their restaurants, they're almost all gone now.
Yeah. I think I might have to,
That's a judgment call on that one.
Yeah, I need a Hasidic scholar to really give me the fine definitions of these things. But yes, it is, I would say it is Googie because
what's that old Woody Allen line? The Talmud says it's okay to eat pork, but only in certain restaurants.
Yes, that's your answer. But I'm glad to report to you, actually, that there is one of those original Arby's. Of course, it had this curving roof. It was shaped like a Conestoga wagon.
Yeah, right.
The old Western. And it had, the sign was this kind of cowboy hat sort of thing. And I'm ashamed to mention that It was only a couple of years ago that I realized that RB means roast beef.
You know, I had that same moment in time years ago.
Yeah.
Roast beef? Oh, my God.
Of course.
There's some people listening now are thinking to themselves, why didn't I think of that sooner? Well, it affects everybody, folks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But no, it is Googie because that curved roof is abstracted. It does have the glass. It has the neon sign. So and it's meant to be seen from the automobile.
Yeah.
So yes.
Yeah, okay.
It is Googie.
Thank you, Rabbi, for that determination.
Bless you, my son.
Now, what about hotels? Were there Googie hotels and hotel chains, too? I know that there were a bunch of them, say, along the Jersey Shore. We did a show about that a number of months ago. But what about out in California?
Oh, definitely, yeah. The primary definition is that it's oriented somehow to the automobile and people living their lives in a modern way. And yes, dry cleaners, banks, which also had drive-throughs, motel chains, quite a number of different types of commercial buildings also adopted the Googie style.
I know that somewhere along the line, these big, outrageous signs that they would have by the road, in the beginning, I think they didn't have that section where they could put in the letters up on it, to spell out a message. And then all of a sudden, everybody had a message board on their sign later on in that process. I didn't know if that was something you had noticed too.
Message boards. I don't know the history of those. I do know that some of the early Holiday Inns in the 50s did have those message boards with movable letters.
Yeah, they had the Great Sign. That was called the Great Sign.
Yeah.
The Holiday Inn giant things, like the Arby's hat.
Which is a piece of Googie design, definitely. But the whole idea, again, Googie is an architecture of communication. The signs are part of that, certainly, but also the whole building is designed to send you a message.
Yeah.
So, all of these modern communication techniques would have been appropriate. Now, to get a little scholarly here, if I may, there was another modern architectural movement about 40 years earlier in Soviet Russia. Constructivists of early Soviet Russia were also interested in an architecture of communication. And in that case, it was to communicate socialist propaganda. But some of Lissitzky and many other Russian constructivist architects used those ideas to create things which looked an awful lot like what later were Googie neon signs. And they would include loudspeakers, and they included signs, and all other sorts of ways to communicate. So the architecture of communication is a modern type. The constructivists did it in the 1920s. Googie architects did it in the 1950s and 60s. Now, there was no connection.
Right.
But once you have architects responding to a particular idea, then the forms are going to have some similarity because the form is following the function.
Right. I was trying to think of more recent buildings of this kind of design strategy. And the only one I could think of was the old Longaberger basket building, which is shaped like this giant basket. They were a gift basket company, right? So it's a 6-story building. It looks like a giant basket. It has handles, big giant handles across the top.
Yeah.
So are there any buildings built in the last 20 years that have followed that function in that Googie way that you know of?
Not as many as there should be.
Okay.
But you bring up a good point. Actually, those buildings are sometimes called programmatic buildings or giant object buildings. Those are an earlier influence on Googie.
Okay.
They date back at least to the 10s and 20s.
Okay.
Again,
we're talking 1910 and 1920.
1920, thank you. But you have things like, the tail of the pup, the giant hot dog that sells hot dogs. You have giant oranges on the roadsides of California and elsewhere that sell orange juice. A building which is meant to communicate what it does. Come in and buy an orange shake, whatever. So those were the result of architects, again, responding to the modern era. The same idea then was reflected in Googie architecture later in modern style. And I want to point out also that in the 1930s, Norman Bill Geddes, the great industrial designer and theatrical designer, wrote a book where he said that these buildings were the coming architecture of modernism. They would have as big an impact as the talkies and vaudeville and all of these other new entertainment forms of that period.
Yeah.
And he saw this early Googie architecture as a part of this modern era.
Well, it's really fascinating. And there's a book people can read about this that you were part of. Tell me about the book.
Yes, it's called Googie Modern, Architectural Drawings of Arme Davis Newlove. And again, that's one of the primary architects who built so many of these, including the Denny's and Bob's Big Boys and others that people across the country will know. And Victor Newlove, the surviving partner, allowed us to publish the original drawings of these buildings from their office. It's an incredible archive, and we reproduce them at high quality, high definition photography. The detail is absolutely amazing. We include 3-foot by 4-foot presentation drawings for clients to sell the building to the client, but where it's almost like a movie. I mean, you have the establishing shot, and then you zoom in on the detail. You see the counter, and you see your seat, so you can walk right in, and it's this modern atmosphere to it through the glass. But then we also include a number of design development sketches where you can see that these were, again, serious architects.
Yeah.
They were developing their ideas, evolving them. This wasn't just, two-dimensional, throw it off on the back of a napkin or something. These are very carefully thought through modern designs. So we have a number of those early design development sketches that show the process.
I mean, you really have to if you're creating an experience for the customer as well as giving them lunch, right, to go into much more detail than one might think. I know in Florida now at Walt Disney World, they have a 3-day, 2-night Star Wars experience where you're immersed inside this galactic star cruiser. And they have made that to every little detail to be like you're on the spaceship. You're immersed in this, what is supposed to be a ship, but it's actually a building. And I got a chance to go on it last year, which was amazing.
Great.
And every little thought about creating the experiences right there.
Yeah.
For instance, you visit the quote planet, right, on your Star Cruiser, and you have to get to the planet via shuttle. So you go to the shuttle bay, and there's this door opens, and you get in this shuttle. Well, the shuttle is actually a specially converted bus. All the windows are blacked out, so it looks like you're traveling through space, and the bus takes you to the planet, right, which is like a quarter mile away, which is the park, and you get out, and it's like you've just stepped off a little space shuttle. I mean, I can see how people were so excited about this in the 40s and 50s with this new architecture.
Yeah, total design.
Yeah.
In these Googie coffee shops, the furniture, the banquettes, the tables, the ornamental or the sconce lights, the textures either of Palos Verdes stone or a concrete block, the colors, all of these things were thought together, again, down to the detail. Actually, Arme Davis often designed the waitress uniforms.
Oh, right. Yes, because they were all coordinated with the palette of the place.
Exactly. Yeah, total design. And we think of total design with Frank Lloyd Wright, for example. But these architects gave the same care to this experience. Again, this is a major thing about Googie architecture. It brought modernism to the masses.
Yeah.
I mean, Denny's, just average restaurant. Anybody could afford it. And yet they also had this quality of architectural design.
Well, this has been fun. I'm getting hungry now, Alan. Thanks so much for coming back and chatting with me.
Good. Always a pleasure, George.
That was George, once again talking with author Alan Hess. Historian, curator, architect, and preservationist Michelangelo Sabatino is a professor of architectural history and preservation in the College of Architecture at Illinois Institute of Technology. His latest book, Carlo Mollino, Architect and Storyteller, co-authored with Napoleon Ferrari, was released in 2021. Maristella Casciato is a senior curator and head of architectural collections at the Getty Research Institute. Born in Italy, Maristella has taught history of architecture at the University of Rome Tor Vergata and the University of Bologna, and she lectures widely throughout Europe and the United States. She recently co-authored the book Rethinking Global Modernism. Here's George's conversation with Michelangelo and Maristella.
In doing some research on both of you, you have a connection to one of our allied organizations, Docomomo. So tell our listeners what Docomomo is all about. Maristella?
Yes, Docomomo is a non-profit organization. We started, and I say we because I was one of the founder members, at the end of the 80s in the Netherlands. The name sounds, Docomomo, quite weird at the beginning, and people were a bit wondering, what is this? Basically, if you unfold the acronym, it's documentation and conservation of, be careful, modern movement, because the very beginning was the architecture of the 20s and 30s. Really, the white box, the Weissen of Siedlung in Germany, Le Corbusier. But now we evolved a lot. And we have chapters all over the world, including a very active American, U.S. chapters, and we do campaign and heritage proposal, a lot of making people aware of the relevance of, I would say, modern architecture beyond the modern movement.
Yes, yes.
And beyond Western culture.
And Michelangelo, you're on the U.S. board.
Indeed, I'm on the board of directors, and we are very active trying to direct public attention toward buildings and sites, landscapes that are under threat. And so we have annual symposia. This upcoming year, we are going to be gathering in New Haven in June. And so our collective effort, as Maristella said, is to identify buildings and expand public awareness. And a point that Maristella is making, although in the late 80s it started focused primarily on the 20s, 30s, 40s, but here, particularly in the United States, we've understood it's important to include a modern and even revisions of the modern. Some have called that the postmodern. Others say it's simply an expansion within the modernist tenet. And so this means that we're bringing in a lot diverse audience, younger audiences. For folks like me, the 60s seem far away, but for 30-year-olds, the 80s seem far away. So our aim is to constantly bring new audiences to understand that the importance, and what I say, the Vitruvian triad is history, preservation, and stewardship. Without these three working hand in hand, and I'm trained as an architectural historian and tend to write more books than actually intervene on buildings, but I do a little bit of that too. But so we're here, and Palm Springs Modernism Week is a perfect place where we can meet with like-minded folks, but also perhaps convert new
devotees, right?
Right.
Docomomo US has a number of chapters. What are some of the cities where they have chapters around?
Well, I'm based in Chicago, and of course, Docomomo US has a very active chapter in Chicago. It is true that we also have a tremendous amount of buildings that are significant building sites, and so they're constantly under threat. And so we have a wonderful active group. Justin Miller is the chair. Serge Ambrose was the former chair for about 4 years. He happens to be my partner, so we're a part of the Docomomo family.
And there's a New York State, right? And Hawaii, right, has one?
Right.
I think about half a dozen or 8 chapters nationally.
Right. And it's great because when the national symposia take place, these chapters help out bringing together resources and making things happen and expanding the network.
Now, you two are here this week to talk about a lot of things. There's a couple of presentations, but specifically I wanted to know more about Carlo Mollino. He's not a name necessarily the average person might know, although they might have been influenced by him in some way through design. Tell me about Carlo.
Well, how to be synthetic. He was a multifaceted architect and designer. He produced photography. He was an educator. He taught at the Turin Polytechnic. So he was a major player in the 20th century. And the reason perhaps that he is less well known, despite the fact that there's several books on his furniture, a recent table of his that was formerly at the Brooklyn Museum sold for $6.2 million. In terms of architecture, he seems a little bit of an esoteric kind of guy. In fact, here in Palm Springs, Maristella and I were wondering if anyone was going to show up to our presentation, and they turned up about 150, and they actually bought some books.
Great.
So he's more seductive than might appear at first glance.
What are some of the things that he did to contribute to design?
Well, I will start from the end of his life, and I think that the Teatro Regio in Torino is really his masterpiece. It's a building where, and this is very unusual, architecture, preservation, because the former theater had burned, and engineering are really fusing each other, intertwined in the most spectacular way. And this is something that, if I think about some also contemporary architects, where I see that engineering, it's not another world, but it's something that really makes architecture more compelling and more interesting in terms of not only formally and aesthetically, but what it serves. In this case, it serves music. And the music hall, the structure of the building, it's really something that remains, in my opinion, one of the 20th century Italian most important buildings. But he had an incredible career, of residential building, public building institution, the Cassa di Risparmio in Torino. So he was a major figure. Coming also, and that's important, from a family well off, of course, maybe you may say of course, but also his father was an engineer. The father built more than 400 buildings. So for him, architecture is this world where technique, aesthetic, form are really intertwined and they become a holistic unity. And this is something that it's not so much maybe appreciated in the 80s and 90s, but now it becomes extremely important.
In fact, I think since we're in the land of Frank Gehry, one might think that Frank Gehry would have an enormous appreciation for Carlo Mollino, so we should interview him and see if that is the case. Maristella mentioned, of course, the Teatro Regio, which is folks that are listening and wish to travel to Turin outside of the beaten path from, say, Florence or Venice. They can actually experience the wonder of this building, but also there is currently the Museo Casa Mollino. It is a residential space, a surreal space that was designed by Carlo Mollino with the intention of simply never living in it. And it sounds...
How do you have an intention to not live in something?
Well, following in the footsteps of the pharaohs that prepared their pyramids for the afterlife, Mollino, too, imagined this space as being a place where he would be accompanied with all of his foo dogs and his fine designs. Some he did himself, others he acquired, like he has a Saarinen table, these huge shells, he has tonne chairs, and so it is an amazing space full of memory and full of transportation to the world of imagination, and that is the single most important thing. So, and it's open to the public. And he also designed for the skiers a remarkable ski station, which is just north of Turin. And it is a combination of traditional techniques with modernist aspirations. The building appears as if it is about to take flight. It's full of nautical and also aeronautical details. And so he was able to mix very traditional materials, block bow, like log construction, with reinforced concrete, piers. He was able to look to antiquity, the Baroque architecture of Turin, full of amazing Baroque architecture. And then also he was enthralled to the automobile. He designed an automobile.
Which one?
The Bisiluro, which he actually tested at Le Mans in the early 50s. He flew airplanes. He also wrote an amazing book about skiing. And you would think, well, why on earth is he writing a book about skiing? Well, he saw skiing as an extension of how a body moves in space. And so as he was a designer of objects, chairs, tables, he had a really keen sense of how to design, keeping in mind the human body. So any time that he moved into other realms like skiing and also flying or driving, it was also about the sensorial dimension. Like Le Corbusier was discussed that. What was it like to design an aircraft in which a body had to go in? It wasn't, so you were aware.
Has he called Boeing or anything? Because I think they still need that kind of help.
Unfortunately, he died in the mid-70s, but thanks now to our book, and of course was co-authored with Napoleone Ferrari, who runs together with his father, Fulvio Ferrari. Both of them have been amazing advocates. They're on a mission to educate the world about Carlo Mollino, and so they are the ones that continue this project, and they're still there in Turin, welcoming enthusiasts, and they get them from all over the world.
Mollino, who was in a certain way a handsome man, he himself capable to express movement with his body. I mean, he is the best example of what futurism may have invented. The body in the space, the body creating the space, the aerofuturismo, of this idea of looking at world from an aircraft, of moving freely. It was something that it's really embedded in his DNA. It's not only architecture, it's really his DNA. When he feels the wind of his driving his car, of the elliptical shape of moving through a race, it's really about how you breathe the space through your body. And I think this is a unique experience after futurism, of course, but really unique for the second half of the 20th century, for instance.
He was also well known for furniture designs, right? What were some of the kinds of products that he put together?
So he designed chairs, tables, and it's important to step back a little bit and say, well, why is this fabulous designer isn't as well known as the Eames, isn't as well known as Marcel Breuer? All chairs and tables designed by these people are now part of our everyday lives. The difference is he never designed for a mass market. He tended to design one-offs or specifically for certain apartments that he sort of designed. So he would take an apartment, let's say for a family of 4, he would design their dining room table and the chairs. And so it was very site-specific, as it were. So that explains also this incredible $6.2 million price tag for the table that was previously at the Brooklyn Museum that went on to the private market. And so I would say tables, chairs were some of the most common types of objects he designed.
I was reading a profile of designer Jeremy Scott, who owns the Elrod House out here in Palm Springs, one of the most famous houses in the valley, where Diamonds Are Forever with James Bond was filmed, where he unsuccessfully fights 2 bikini-clad women, I think Bambi and Thumper, right there in the living room. And in his profile of Scott, he talks about
some photographs, some Polaroids of Mollino's that were found after his death that were an inspiration to Jeremy's fashion line. Tell me about those.
Right. So it's important to state that Polaroids with scantily clad women generate a lot of interest, but he saw these Polaroids as personal explorations of design. It wasn't that he was a pervert trying to sexualize women.
It was just all in the line of duty, is what you're saying.
Yes. Well, for example, he would carefully design these photographs. He would pick, for example, since he recently died, I'll recall Paco Rabanne. For example, Paco Rabanne designed these metal-clad outfits that were very popular, but that was just one example. And so Mollino would think about the design of a chair in relationship to the human body. And so it's just like, for example, can you imagine the womb chair being photographed without a person in it? The whole point of the womb chair is that the body becomes one of that. And so that is similar to what Mollino was thinking about. It just so happened that they were beautiful women and, elusive. And then one last thing, there's a couple of photos where he photographs them from the side where you can actually see the curve of the spine. So, back to all about business. But when you think of design as being, in many important instances, ergonomic, sort of having designers study the body in order to understand what kind of back of the chair it might have. So let's just say it was a combination of research, pleasure, because why not? Isn't architecture and design about pleasure? Isn't it about embracing the beauties of life? And women are beautiful parts of the world. Why not?
I'm sure there's some ergonomics guys now. They're going, I think I have an idea.
There is another remark that I would make. He was interested in fashion, of course, but he was also interested in the materiality of the fabric. Don't forget that Torino and the environment Torino is still today the place where in Italy and in Europe the best fabric are produced. I mean, the French designers, the famous one, the Yves Saint Laurent and so on, they all use fabric that are produced in Biella around Torino. So I'm sure that he was also interested in this materiality of the fashion, how a tissue, a fabric can really become part of the body. And there is something that, again, is related to the culture of Turin. Turin, it's a very special environment, not only intellectually, but in terms of factory. It's not only the Fiat. It's much more than simply the Fiat in Torino. And he was part of that culture and that society, 100%.
I was wondering, when the Olympics were held there, did they do any special exhibitions on Mollino, or did he get any coverage during that time as one of the famous people from that area?
The real coverage he received in Turin was in conjunction with the centennial of his birth. And so in 2006, there was a series of exhibitions, both on his architecture and his design. And so Turin embraced their native son. But I will also say that Mollino was a bit of an outsider. Although he taught in the university there, he built most of his work, significant work, was in and around Turin. Because he was not easy architect and designer to understand, even amongst his peers, he struggled to gain widespread support. But because he was his own thing, he was his own orbit, and he thankfully had the means to also be able to conduct his own experiments, and he had clients. Let's not forget that. His clients, progressive clients, gave him commissions, both in the realm of private buildings, but also in the public realm.
Right.
For example, the Teatro Regio is a municipal client, so he was fortunate that way.
Well, Maristella, Michelangelo, thank you so much for spending time with us here.
We are happy to be here, George. Keep up the good work.
George, thank you. We wish to support all your efforts. It's important.
Thanks for listening. Want to go with us to Modernism Week in February 2024 and hang out at the U.S. Modernist compound? Email me, george@usmodernist.org. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Visit U.S. Modernist's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 15,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.1 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Kelly Policelli researched all the guests for our Modernism Week interviews, 42 of them this year. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I will be back in 2 weeks with more great guests from Modernism Week in Palm Springs.